Hi again then guys, and welcome to of course another bike review from the world of Ride 3, and this is a very personally special episode to me because it's one of my favourite motorcycles, not just in the game but in real life as well. Definitely one of my favourite Ducatis. It used to actually be my favourite Ducati up until very recently, within the past year or so, when the Ducati Diavel has actually become my favourite model that they have, the Diavel Carbon in particular. This one though I still have a lot of love for, predominantly actually for sentimental reasons. Ever since I was a kid, about 6 or 7 years old, I used to play a PlayStation 1 game with my old man called Ducati World Racing. My favourite colour has always been yellow, and vehicles that were yellow simply caught my attention more. And that was the beginning of a lifelong love affair with the 748. It really stood out amongst the sea of red, in a similar way to Ferrari of course, Ducati being in effect the Ferrari of bikes, and the 748 just, even at that early age, really appealed to me. Because it wasn't the most powerful thing around, but it was so good through corners, and that is what this bike's real piece de resistance is. Because this particular platform of bike from Ducati was used with a number of different engine configurations that all looked fairly similar from a bodywork point of view, and it was more than anything else the livery that separated them. You had the 748 for instance, of course the 916, the iconic 998, and those models actually spanned quite a few years. In fact, you could say it kind of looked like a classic when it ended production in 2002, in a very similar way to the Mazda FD RX-7, which also ended production around a similar time in the car world. However, as the engine and the name suggests, this is a smaller bike, significantly smaller, around 200cc or more compared to some of those others such as the 998. The 748cc engine, which unsurprisingly for a Ducati is a V-twin, a thumpy little motor. I love the sound that these make, but it doesn't have a huge amount of power. The torque is pretty good, which is not too surprising for a Ducati, 74 Newton meters, but the power is fairly low by modern standards at 105 brake horsepower. Now, the bike itself is not overly heavy. It weighs bang on 200 kilos, which again, of course there are far lighter things out there now, but that was pretty good for the 90s. And when you combine that with the much more cornering focused setup that the bike had compared to much more of a straight line machine, not just from Ducati of course, but from other brands as well, Japan and beyond, well, what you ended up with is almost like this MotoGP style bike for the road, but with a much more attainable price tag than any actual race bike would of course have. Now, to be specific, my favourite version of the 748 is actually not this one. This is the standard one. My favourite is the SP version, and there are kind of 3 different levels, if you will, of the 748 overall. You've got the standard, the SP, and the SPS, which is the most hardcore of all. My favourite being, as I said, the SP, which is somewhere in between. Even this one though is still a force to be reckoned with, and in terms of upsides and downsides and how it compares to other bikes, I will say that to the surprise of precisely no one, this bike definitely carries over its real-world strengths and weaknesses into the game, which obviously is exactly what you'd want it to be, because that is an accurate representation. Now, with 105 horsepower, of course it's not going to concern a modern 750 bike, or even some smaller engine modern bikes in a straight line. It just doesn't have that kind of performance. The acceleration is good in a relative sense, 0 to 60 is decent enough. Top end wise, if I recall correctly, I think it was about a 150 mile an hour bike in real life, fairly similar in the game. So as I said, there are plenty of modern 600s and 750s that can wipe the floor with it in a straight line, but that's not the point of the bike. When you get this motorcycle onto a circuit where you rarely get above, say, 130, and it's all about the cornering, and especially a circuit such as, for instance, the Nürburgring, the Nordschleife, where it's all about that flow from corner to corner, and you're not just relying on the sheer overwhelming power of like a big liter bike, for instance, just to destroy the straights. The Nürburgring has its straights, as most circuits do, but this bike really comes into its element when it's about the cornering flow. A track where you don't need more than 100 horsepower. It just has such fantastic cornering manners, and one of the great things as well about this platform of bike, and this is carried over to the 9 models as well, the 916, 998 for instance, is it's physically a pretty small bike. By today's standards especially, it's a very compact machine, and even though for a 750, 200 kilos might sound hefty, it really does not feel anywhere near 200 kilos. You could easily guess that this was maybe a 160, maybe 170 kilo bike, easily, because it handles so well. It really is sublime through corners, and I think one of the best things about it as well is because it has this great combination of raw, almost competition level cornering and handling and average speeds through sweeping corners, but also combined with a relatively modest amount of torque and power. It actually makes it, as far as a supersport bike goes, very beginner friendly, and that's a great advantage to have, for instance, if you're newer to the game, because if you jump on, some Kawasaki Ninja or even another Ducati, something like a Panigale or whatever, you've got the sheer straight line performance for days, but the cornering is much more challenging. The bike itself is heavier, very, very torquey. You open up the throttle, you can easily just pop a wheelie and fly straight off the bike. Again, if you're newer to the game in particular, and even just reining in that kind of power can be a challenge sometimes, slamming on the brakes, scrubbing off all that power and speed. Of course, the faster the bike, the more difficult that can become. In a bike that's only got 105 horsepower anyway, there's not much to scrub off, and that's the great thing about the bike. Riding the 748 in this game feels exactly as I would want it to. Like you are a tiny little person strapped on the back of a bumblebee, just flying through corners as if traction isn't even an equation to this bike. The physics and laws of physics of usual racing don't even seem to apply to it. It sticks like it's on flypaper. It corners like an actual race bike, but it's so forgiving at the same time. There's no kind of overwhelming torque or power. The engine at the same time, being a relatively thumpy V-twin, doesn't even need to be worked that hard. It's a very responsive, very playful, but also very forgiving bike. And the really great thing about that is that not only does it appeal, as I already mentioned, to beginners, for sure, in fact it's possibly one of the best 750s out there for beginners, or even one of the best sub 1 litre bikes really, but because it is so good through corners with phenomenal brakes, great weight for its time, etc., plus it's so physically compact, it means that as well as being beginner friendly, it is an absolute pro-friendly machine as well, because the more experienced you are, the more you can wring out of this bike. You can use every horsepower, every newton meter of torque, and take advantage of every kilo that this bike drops compared to its competitors of the time, and really take advantage of that super compact body style to weave through opponents, fly through tight corners. It's almost so good that you can kind of decide when you want to brake, and that is a great feeling when you have a bike that's just so forgiving and so grippy that you can think, well, do I actually want to brake for this corner? Do I need to? These aren't questions that you would usually ask in something like a 1200 litre bike, for instance, from modern times, because you need to slow down well ahead of time. On this, it almost feels like a steroided out version of a 125 in a weird kind of way, and I absolutely love it for that. Overall though, that's it for my thoughts on the 748. Of course, tell me yours down below. Are you a fan of the bike? Maybe not so much of a fan? Maybe has this review encouraged you to try out the 748, because it is easier sometimes to forget some of these 90s and 2000s machines, and there is still a lot to love from many of them, especially if you want more of a pure sport bike experience. But overall, as I said, that's it for my thoughts. Stick around on the channel for more ride content, and of course click the playlists here on screen to either watch my other ride reviews or to watch my real world bike reviews as well. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.